Hello, Shirley Adams with Program 6, Series 2 of The Sewing Connection. Velvets and velours are wonderfully soft, touchable fabrics, but with several differences. The velvets used to be strictly for dressy occasions, but now they're appropriate mixed with wools, tweeds, suedes, and leather for day, as well as with jewels and lace and satins for evening. A versatile fabric, but one that needs special precautions. An extra set of yarns, as it is woven, produces the surface pile. Usually the pile smooths down for a sort of a frosty look, if you like that look, if you want the paler look, or it goes up if you want a deeper, richer color. The fiber content may be silk or synthetic or cotton. This cotton that I have here already went through the washer and dryer to pre-treat, and that's one of the lovely things about cotton. But silks are delicate. They are not washable, and you have to take very special precautions with the silks. Also, the velours have a pile surface, but these are knit fabrics, and they're easier to handle and to work with, and they work well in sports clothing is where we usually see them. Well, the first thing you need to do when you look through them in the store is decide exactly what it is you're going to be buying. As I said, this cotton one that I have down here has already been through the washer and dryer, and what that indicates is that it might be the easiest of the group to work with, and that is true. Now, the silk one here is a lot more difficult, and you can usually tell most easily by looking at the backing what type fabric it is. But this one, and of course it'll be labeled too, but this one is a silk. And this is very delicate. It's very soft, very drapey. It makes up nicely into very soft styling. These two are rayons, this one a little softer, this one a little firmer. But with these rayons, they're a little bit more sturdy, a little bit stronger perhaps than the silk velvet, and with a little bit less problems. The prettier, softer it is what I'm indicating, the more problems you may be having. The first thing you're going to have to decide then after you get it home, once you do have it purchased, is how are you going to store it? Well, take a cue from what they have in the store and notice with any of the synthetics or the silks, they always have them hung on these square things, these metal things, and they're hung there loosely. And when you get one of those home, you hang it the same way with safety pins from a hanger. Do not put it in any clamps or it will mar the surface. So just the selvage here, you're going to fold your fabric at home up with, and the selvage is what you'd use big safety pins and hang through several layers at once and put them on a hanger, and this is how you'd store it in your closet. Now frankly I didn't with this cotton velvet because it goes through the washer and dryer, and any little mars that you get in it from folding up will disappear. It isn't going to be a problem. I actually did have this folded before I made it up into the skirt. I'm still going to make the top up into something, but I haven't decided what. So I'll have to make that decision later. Then after you get them home, besides storing them, once you get to working on them, you're going to have to get to know these and decide what it is you can do with them. You better have a pattern picked out that's appropriate for it, and of course you always read on the back of the pattern envelope what kind of fabrics are acceptable and will work out well. But try things out on scraps too, and you may change your mind in the middle of the project and decide, nope, I'm really not going to cut this out at all. I'm going to do something different because of the way this particular one reacts. So pressing is going to be a problem, and you better find out what will happen there. With this very delicate one, I probably would not even bring the iron close to it. I probably would, for one thing, press either on a velvet board or an extra big scrap of velvet as this is, and I just have this serged around the edges and use it to cover my ironing board when I'm sewing with velvets, and it provides a nice surface because the pile is up, and I would put then whatever I'm pressing with the pile down on it, the right sides together in other words, and do my pressing there. But I would be extremely cautious with this. So I'd set the iron on nothing too very hot, and very possibly it's just getting close to it with the iron and letting some of the steam get down in there. And once the steam is in there, then maybe you just sort of pat it the way you want to, and that might be the safest for starters at least. On a scrap of fabric, treat it more roughly maybe, but make sure you know what you're doing before you actually do any pressing on your garment. You also would need to, with this, test out a little seam and then see how to press that seam open, and probably pressing the seam open I would use a seam roll like this, one that you purchase, or frankly what this is a rolled up magazine taped together and then covered with a terry towel, and it makes a nice surface also. Now what's nice about this, if you are going to do a seam, is the fact that seam won't be pressed, the edges won't be pressed down into a smooth, a flat surface. If you have this roll, that's the purpose of it. That's why it's a seam roll. So with the terry cloth, that might be another surface under this. If you do have an actual velvet board, a needle board, they usually only come so large, not very big at all, and about this big is the size of it. And if you would put your velvet on top of that, and if it would extend out beyond the edge and you'd put your iron on that, you can guess that very readily it would leave impression marks. So be very careful about those and don't get your iron beyond the edges of those velvet boards. Well, find out what it will do. With the silks and with some of the synthetics, I would suspect that when you come to interfacing it then, that you may want to do some sew-ins, some sew-in interfacing rather than fusibles. But don't rule out fusibles completely, because I find a great deal of surprises in this area. For instance, I'm going to put a synthetic one down on the board, and I'm going to put a cotton one down on the board. And while we're at it, why don't we put these other two down to see what happens if I fuse on all of them. I'll put my fusible interfacing going across a little bit of each of them and see what it happens. See which it destroys and which it will leave intact so that it's going to look really nice. So with the wrong sides up here, and I really don't even have anything under this. It would have been a good idea for most of the fabrics. It would have been a good idea to put them on the velvet, but I'm doing this. I'm really giving them the acid test. I'm being hard on them to see what will happen. So if I just put a piece of fusible interfacing over all of them and give them a little fusing here, let's see what results. I think I can already predict in most cases what's going to happen, and I'm actually letting go of the iron. That's not a really good idea, except that I am just testing this. This is not anything that I'm going to use. So for testing, I would do this. Most generally, if I'm actually pressing the garment, I won't let go of the iron. I'll let it hover just slightly above or just barely touch it without. But if you're going to fuse, of course, you have to have pressure on this. So that's why I'm giving them such a hard treatment, to see if they will actually withstand that. So when I turn the whole group over, let's see what happens. And surprisingly enough, they all look pretty decent, even though I didn't even use a velvet board over them. Now, is that saying, okay, I might use that, I might do something with one of these fabrics, maybe they aren't all that difficult after all, but really do use something on your ironing board surface. Use a texture so that the texture blends in with the texture of the pile fabrics. Now, if you're wondering what's the difference between pile fabrics and napped fabrics, maybe we better mention that for a second here. These velvets and velours, the corduroys, velveteens, any of these are pile fabrics, and that means that they're woven with, it's a double cloth really, and it's woven with an extra set of yarns in between. And then a real sharp knife goes between those two layers and slits it. And this is what results, this pile fabric. So that's why this pile is sticking up. And if you would, for instance, ravel a little bit of this out, what you would find is that a lot of those little, see how it's clinging, all that fuzz that's clinging there to the fibers that I fray out? Well, that was that fifth set of yarns that went between the two, and that's what's fraying here. And it does, of course, make a complete mess in your sewing room, so be prepared to come out with the vacuum and frequently clean up. Now notice how I have this pile fabric hanging also. I found that it does mar even this tough one, even this cotton one. It can mar it if I would actually clamp a hanger directly to this. So here again, to hang up a skirt, it's a good idea to either put it on with pins, as I did on the storage type fabric, or else do something of this sort. Put a tape, whatever. Here I have a little hem lace, and I've stitched it in with a waistband as I did the back of it. And I did this for the purpose of hanging it. It drops down inside the skirt then when it's being worn, so it doesn't show, of course. But do something of that sort. I found with this tough velvet that even if I covered it up with something, here's a little piece of felt, even if I covered it with this and then put the clips on it, that it still marred the velvet somewhat. So be careful with that. Don't do anything that can mar that velvet. You may or may not be able to get those marks out. Well, these were the pile fabrics. Here are napped fabrics back here on the rack, just to briefly tell you the difference between them. And these napped fabrics you do with the nap, this shaggy mohair I have here, you do with the nap going down, because if you had the nap going up, you don't have a choice here. It would get all full of pills, those little balls. It would look ugly very quickly, as opposed to the choice that you have with the velvets and the pile fabrics. Down here I have another napped fabric, and here you also have a choice. This is ultra suede, and the same as with the velvets. If the nap goes up, then you have a deeper, richer color. If it goes down, you have a frostier color. So again, you choose the color that you would prefer as you're going to lay your pattern and cut this out. Now generally, with a pattern choice, with making these velvets, choose something kind of simple, because it's a beautiful fabric, and you want that fabric quality to star. You don't want to break it up with all sorts of intricate seaming and details. So usually when you see velvet garments, they are rather simple. And once you get to sewing, you'll be glad that they're simple, because you may have some problems in the stitching. So be careful about that pattern choice. Then as soon as you do choose the pattern and get it altered, and do alter that pattern, in fact, why don't you make a test garment out of it? Because you are not going to do any alterations on this. I assure you, you would not want to take out a seam and redo it. It does mar. Even the toughest velvets, they do mar if you rip out a seam. In fact, I've already done a seam here just to see what would happen. Here I've done one on machine, and here I've done one with basting, because if you have any doubts, you want to baste that before you start. So I'll just rip this one out and see what happens. And I'm sure that what we will see is lines that look terrible where the seam used to be. So because of those terrible looking lines, that says, once you have made this velvet outfit, don't grow, because it is not going to let out to accommodate your added girth. Therefore, be careful with it. Now, speaking of growing, these are even good for children, these cotton velvets, and very often they're made into children's garments because they are easy to care for. If now this basted one, and this is basted with silk thread, if this basted one is pulled out, you possibly, or perhaps won't. I really don't see any markings here very easily. Just slightly. I can brush those up with my finger, I'm sure, and they will disappear. Now, what you do not want to do, of course, when you stitch, is stitch over a pin, because if you would stitch over a pin, it would produce a mark that perhaps won't come out. So be careful about that. Well, after you get to know this a little bit, it's time to cut it out, of course, and as you cut it out, be sure that your shears are sharp, because if they are not, you can do some really nasty things with them. So do have the sharp shears so that you won't have any problems about cutting, because otherwise, without the sharp ones, instead of cutting, it kind of chews it and makes a nasty looking edge. So be careful about that. Really good shears for this. Now, as soon as we start sewing, we're going to see immediately what the problem is with pile fabrics, with any of them. And it's this. Here's another pile fabric. It's a little scrap of carpeting. And with this little scrap of carpeting that I have here, if I would just put my finger down repeatedly on this, it would walk itself right across there, or this is actually a little scrap of paper. Notice on the carpeting in your house, it does the same thing. If you're a rug cutter, when you cut out your fabric and get down there to do that, notice how some things just walk right along that carpeting. So be careful about that. But anyway, that indicates what we're going to have with our pile fabric here. So I'm going to tell which direction I'm going to have to smooth this all ways. And I find that it's very hard with this one to tell what the direction is. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why this is going to be a little easier to sew with. But as I do sew and make a seam here, let's see what happens if we have any problems at all with it. Now typically, the same as on that carpeting sample, typically the problem is that it creeps. Can you see a little bubble forming here in the top layer of this when I don't do anything to it, when I just let it go? What that bubble says is the top layer is pushing along, it's creeping, and at the same time, see how the back of this is turning up a little bit? That says because the top layer is creeping this way, the underlayer is going backwards, and so that's why it's curling up. Now there are several things you can do to overcome this. For one thing, I just push the little needle down lever position there, button, and so now when I sew, the needle will stay down if I quit. And with that needle down, then I would adjust the fabric. I would let it relax here and stitch again. Every few stitches you might want to do that. Relax your fabric and see what happens. See if it doesn't improve it. If it still creeps, then you're going to have to take more measures, better measures than this. And those measures might be possibly using a different needle or a different foot. Maybe if you find you can't use standard presser feet, you can use a dual feed foot, the walking presser foot, and that might be the type that works best for you. So try that out if that will do the job. You might also try stitching with between these two layers with some tissue paper, because sometimes that will work. So since it was scooting on its own, let's see what happens if I put some tissue in between this and do the same job again. Now what I would like to happen is that nothing moves. Everything works out just beautifully, but I won't be sure of that until I sample this, and that's why I'm saying after you cut out your project, be sure you do work with all of these scraps and see what happens. And this is even worse. Not only with the tissue paper is it making a bigger bubble, but also it's scooting sideways. It's really creating a problem, and one that you might not even expect, but this one is really a mess, and so this isn't going to be the answer. You might on one of these even try diagonal basting, and if you do any basting, hand basting that is, it's a good idea to do this with silk thread or with some of the thin, the real fine embroidery thread, the rayon type thread, and it's a diagonal basting like this is what I'm doing, sideways, so that as I take each stitch I go a little sideways, and I would do this out in the seam. I would do this not where it would appear later at all, just in case anything shows up. I would instead do this diagonal basting in the seam allowance and then stitch next to it so that nothing happens, so that nothing shows. I can take it out later. But this way nothing is going to creep. It is going to hold in place nicely, and so that's a good way to handle it. So find out all those nasty things that it might do on your machine and overcome those on the scraps before you ever get to the actual garment, so that when you get to that you can breeze right through it and not have any problems at all. Another thing you're going to have to know on your garment is what kind of seam finishes are you going to do? Well, here I've done a few. I've done some zigzag stitching and some kind of a blanket stitch here. I've also used a little seam saver to cover here, or you might try this on your serger to see what it does. On the skirt that I had in my hands a little bit ago, the one that's on the rack, on that one I did serge all the seams and it worked beautifully that way. So that was a very quick way to do it, but try it on yours to see what happens. If you have any darts in that pattern, then by all means make a dart on this fabric first to see what it looks like before you do a dart in your garment. And if you find it's very poor at darts, it really doesn't work out that way at all, think of what the alternatives would be. Can you ease something in? Instead of darts in that skirt that I showed you, I had gathers at the waist, so that made it a little bit easier. Think also what's going to happen with the bulk. On this sample that I have here, because it ended up rather bulky for facings. Facings is what I'm concerned about here, if you have any facings, because if I'd stitch on this facing and turn it to the back side, grade it, do all those good things, it would still be very bulky here at the edge. So I would be very strongly tempted to instead use a lining fabric or use some sort of a silky fabric, a thin fabric, interface that, and then sew that on right sides together, and by the time that's flipped back and forms the facing, you'll have a whole lot less bulk involved, and it will probably feel a lot nicer, a lot more professional, a lot smoother around the edge. Getting way down to the bottom of it, what are you going to do with the hem? And here it might be anything from some sort of a finish, maybe a binding. Any of those are likely to show through as it's pressed. I decided on this, after I tried everything imaginable, I decided just a hem lace is going to do the best job, so that's what I have inside my pink skirt. Now I still haven't done anything with that velvet jacket, so I have to do a little bit more thinking there because it's a different garment, it's a different pattern, it's going to have different choices to make with it. Then as far as the velours go, let's see what happens with those, and these are really easy to work with. The biggest problem you'll find with the velours are, look at this curling. Because it curls so much, it's a good idea when you work with these velours to not cut it out until you're ready to sew, because immediately when you cut out, it's pretty good. And it's as it sits for hours or days, that's when it starts curling up. And especially the all cotton ones, as this one is. The synthetics don't curl the way this one does, but these cotton ones are so nice. What I have here then is a striped fabric, and I want to see, I'm probably going to serge this because it's for sports garments. It's going to be for a big sweatshirt, a velour sweatshirt. I want to, of course, match those stripes perfectly. So I have them held here in a position where they do match perfectly. And I want to see exactly how that works. Now, when I do this on machine, even though I have them held here in place, let's see if they stay in place or if this one creeps along. And if it does creep, then I know I'm going to have to take special precautions with this also and not just do this in a hurry. Now, you could possibly fudge a little on this. And on a solid fabric, one that does not have stripes, maybe you could do this, and if it does creep a little bit, maybe it wouldn't make that much difference. But if it does that on the stripe, it most assuredly makes a big difference, and one that you would not want to see. See how that goes off only about a 1/16 of an inch. But if stripes that are mismatched bother you as much as they do me, a 1/16 of an inch is too much. Okay, if this happens repeatedly and there's no way you can get around it, figure for that mishap. Instead of putting them right together when you set these, then do this with the top layer of fabric a 1/16 of an inch behind in the stripes, so that when you stitch over it, it'll come out just right. You can do this successfully, I assure you. And of course, then making a sweatshirt will just really be a snap. It will go very, very fast. So these seams that I have here, usually with velour, there isn't a whole lot of stretch in it the way there would be in some of the other t-shirt or sweatshirt types. So since there is not a whole lot of stretch in it, usually it's used in combination with bands of various sorts. So if that's the case, I have here some stretch fabric. This is some of the banding that you would put on it. And what I have done, these are going to be the cuffs. I've just pressed them in half. I've made them the size they need to be. And I find with this that's very stretchy, the best way to do it is to have it about 2 to 3 ratio, about 2 inches of this, for instance, to 3 inches of the garment, whatever that is. So if I'm going to put this all together, I would do this also on the serger. And as I do this on the serger, I'm going to kind of stretch this out. I was actually going to make this whole sweatshirt in a few minutes. I don't know that we have time for this because I talked more than I had intended to. So in case I don't have time, I'm going to at least put band on. And this is one of the sleeves that I have here. It is, yes, one of the sleeves, so the band will go on there. Therefore, I have this band all ready to go, and I'm just going to put it together here at the start, and then I'll put it together at the finish, and then just do a little stretching. Now, remember with the serger, keep the pins far out of the way. You don't want to hit any of them. So I'm just going to serge a little bit of this right at the start, and then as I progress slightly, after the needles get in the fabric and hold it, then I can stretch the rest of this out and see how it does stretch terrifically so that it can go all the way across the bottom. So I think I can probably just hold this without having any more pins on it and do the serging this way. Okay, just to guide it a little bit. Whenever you need to stop, do that. Readjust it until you're finished. If the ribbing that you use is not all this stretchy, then perhaps a 3 to 4 ratio would work better. But this one really stretched, so 2 to 3 works very nicely. But this would be the little cuff down at the sleeve. And you can see that it does then pull in the velour and make it work just right. So if well, you can see by putting on this cuff how fast it would be to do the whole sweatshirt. So this might be a good place to start on pile fabrics, the fact that it is so very quick and easy. After you have some of these seams in, this is a child's sweatshirt. An adult one wouldn't take all that much more time, just bigger areas to go through, and I'm kind of without getting out to the end and cutting it off. I was just doing a couple of them real fast. And once you have these done, now this is one of those little sweatshirts that has raglan sleeves, so I have the 2 sleeves on. Where I thought I put a band a few minutes ago, I probably didn't. It probably was down at the bottom, but that's okay, I can fix that, so it'll be all right. Okay, then what I would have left to do is that other piece that I already have here with the ribbing on it that I'd put between. Then it's just a matter of putting that little ribbing around the neck, putting it on the other sleeve, doing it on the bottom, and you'd be finished really in just a few minutes. So velours are very easy to use. Not quite as much, you remember, with the velvets. So I'm still going to think about this. Now what I'm thinking about with this is it going to be for every day or is it going to be dressy? If I use this for every day, I'll put daytime type buttons on it. If it's going to be dressy, I might put something a little glittery, something quite glittery in fact. So I have to make some decisions on this before I go beyond, and I'll do that before I pick out my pattern and finish it up. Well, something else that's really easy besides doing this is setting in a sleeve. And many have such a problem with it that we're going to spend the next time perfecting that technique. Come join me then and we'll set in sleeves.